Heavy thunderstorms have led to flash flooding in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom and Addison County, resulting in washed out roads and at least one Swiftwater Rescue.
The damage is horrendous. It's just horrible that we're hit again after, third time, 3 years in a row.
Plus, an increased reliance on Vermont's prisons by federal immigration authorities is causing strain. And the state's largest social service provider announces program cuts and layoffs. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thank you for joining us for Vermont This Week. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, July 11th, and with us on the panel today we have Colin Flanders from 7 Days, Lexi Krupp from Vermont Public, and Ethan Weinstein from VTDigger. Thank you all so much for being here. We have to start with something I wish we didn't have to talk about. It seems to happen every summer now. Lexi, flash flooding hits the Northeast Kingdom, Addison County. We saw some images there in the show open. What's the latest you can tell us about these storms?
Yeah, yesterday there were these slow-moving rain and thunderstorms that brought 3 to 5 inches in a couple towns in the state. So I talked to folks in Sutton and Burke in the Northeast Kingdom, which there in Burke, I believe there was 3 inches of rain in 1 hour. They had 5 inches of rain total yesterday. So yeah, this flash flooding that's resulted in a lot of roads being washed out. In Sutton, I know there was one family, a couple and a dog, who were rescued from their roof yesterday. And there are about 20 people or 20 homes in Sutton that are still cut off from road access. So right now, road crews are out and just trying to work on getting access to those homes, but that probably will take a couple of days. So
the good news is that as far as we know, there have been no fatalities. Most of this is structural damage, but it's terrible. It's devastating. And Colin, I know that you talked with some of the Swiftwater Rescue folks. So what were they telling you about what they had to do?
Yeah, so I talked to the chief of the Swiftwater Rescue team, and he said they had 3 state teams and then 4 local agency teams out until about 1 a.m. last night. And I think the significance of this event, I think everybody knows July 10th is sort of the day now. This is the 3rd July 10th in a row. And I think it's the psychological impacts of this. I think what I've been really interested in is the fact that this is starting to feel like inevitable, that we are seeing these things more and more. And in talking to the Swiftwater team earlier this summer, as they were gearing up for what they expected to be another busy summer, I recall one conversation where one of their team managers said after the second year, the second July 10th, it was a real wake-up call. Obviously, the first July 10th storm was really serious, but to see it happen again was really driving home the point that we need to be ready for this. And I think this is just another one of those examples.
Well, to that point, is there any kind of silver lining in that it's almost expected now, so maybe they were a little more prepared this time, like kind of expecting it to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is I wouldn't go as far as silver, maybe that's like a light gray line, but I will say I think that there is being more attention paid to the need not only to prepare for these on the front end, but also to be able to respond to them. The state legislature this year gave $450,000 to this state team to help it prepare. It's not as much money as it was hoping for, but I think there is an acknowledgement that we need to make sure that we have Swiftwater teams ready. And I think a lot of people just think they sort of form, like they just come together like the Avengers, but I think there's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of planning, and this is why.
And we're going to have to keep a watch too on, and this is a subject for another time, but what happens with FEMA and the kind of help that could be expected there, because changes are coming to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I want to move on to a story, Ethan Weinstein, that you were reporting on, which is really important. And, you know, it deals with something on a much bigger, broader national level, and these are federal detainments, but they're happening in Vermont prisons. And you wrote a story about this, about the strain that it's putting on the Department of Corrections. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's been really challenging as a reporter to try to figure out how ICE and CBP are working in Vermont. We know that in the past they've been detaining increasing numbers of people at the northern border. That's slowed down a bit, but My reporting has looked at what's happening in Vermont's prisons, and we know that ICE and Border Patrol are relying on the state's prisons to hold immigration detainees, and these are people that most often they're not charged with crimes, they're charged with civil immigration offenses. And so we were able to get a window into how this relationship is working by using a public records request to see how prison officials are talking about ICE. And, you know, what that brought to light was they're pretty frustrated with the increasing workload put on them by their federal partners.
What are some examples of things that they're having to do that they wouldn't normally have to do if ICE wasn't bringing these prisoners here?
I mean, some of it almost might seem petty. ICE will just sort of list demands that come as a surprise to prison officials. So they say, we need closed-toed shoes, we need bagged lunches, we need you to print out medical histories. And this came sort of unannounced for prison officials. But more than that, I think it's you know, the number of people that are being moved through the facilities. There was one incident that led to a lot of internal communications where in a 24-hour period, ICE had moved 35 people through the prison in St. Albans. And what the superintendent there noted was there's going to be a security issue that occurs. We're not built for this. People are being lax with their keys. They're being rude to each other during this handoff. It's just, it's not working.
And to be clear, these are people that would not otherwise be there had ICE not put them there.
That's correct. They're not charged with a state or a federal crime, for the most part. There are some people.
Silly question, perhaps. Is that legal to hold people without being charged with a crime?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, it's at least the practice of the federal government right now.
Because it's a civil offense, they're being held for that.
That's correct.
Okay.
And some of these people are able to get out on bail or bond once they have hearings, but that takes time.
Something else that cropped up that you were reporting on with this is incidents of tuberculosis became a problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, the folks that ICE or Border Patrol are bringing to Vermont's prisons are coming from all around the world, and some of those countries have a higher prevalence of TB than the United States, and this is a disease. I think there's something like 10,000 cases annually in the United States, but it's not something we think about as particularly prevalent. But because there are language issues and because Vermont's prisons aren't accustomed to working with this population, although they're increasingly accustomed to it, what they were finding was that they'd bring people in, they would test them for TB, but they wouldn't necessarily isolate them from the rest of the population. And so there were at least a couple instances when people were being held in general population and then their TB test would come back positive, and the medical contractor that the state's working with flagged this as a really significant, concern.
Yeah, and yet another problem that they aren't necessarily ready to deal with and certainly don't want to have to deal with. Ethan, hold that thought too, because I want to come back to this case about ICE's contract with the state of Vermont in just a moment. But I want to ask Colin about another story that relates to the criminal justice system, and you were writing about this. It's a case of mistaken identity that you were writing about. And I have to believe this is one of the most surreal moments that you can ever see in a courtroom, where a defense attorney says to the judge, sorry, this is not my client. What happened here?
Yeah, so this was a hearing on Monday morning. It was not just a typical in 5 minutes and out. I mean, this was 2 hours planned of court time to vet the charges against a defendant who has been accused of shooting someone in Burlington. So this is a serious felony. This is something that the court system has been focused on, trying to litigate these in a timely manner, efficiently. A lot of time went into making sure everyone was there, the witnesses, everybody subpoenaed. And then the defendant walks in and the defense attorney says exactly that this is not my client. I have no idea who this is.
And this is an attempted murder charge.
Yeah, so this is an attempted murder charge. And so after a little back and forth, the judge had to call on some of his decades-old Spanish to speak to this man who was there, who did not speak any English, had no idea why he was brought into this courtroom. And it turns out that they had the wrong person. His last name was Gonzalez. The other guy's last name was Gonzalez. And there was a switch up at the prison prison. There were a lot of people who are frustrated about this because of the court time, because of all that, but also because of the impacts. One man had his trial delayed. His case is going to be delayed weeks. And the other man was dragged out of prison, brought shackled, put in a courtroom, had no idea why he was there, was not given a translator, and then was told, sorry, you're not supposed to be here. It's unclear how much, if any of it, he understood.
You know, I asked Ethan a legal question, and I understand you're not an attorney either, but I do have to ask, I mean, aren't folks supposed to have interpreters if they can't understand English? Isn't that the law, that they have an interpreter that can let them know why they're being taken in?
Yeah, well, the problem in this case is that they thought the defendant spoke English. Turned out the defendant didn't speak English because they brought the wrong defendant. But this fits into what Ethan is reporting, because the man that they actually brought to court is not facing any state charges whatsoever. He has actually been held by the federal government because he's accused of crossing the border illegally about a week ago. And so this is this fits into the prison conversation as well, that the man, when he's charged federally, his name is on the document with two surnames, as is common in Latin America. So this is a switch up that shouldn't really happen. This mistake shouldn't happen, but Vermont prisons aren't used to dealing with a lot of these, and they're really busy. And so when you asked DOC about it, they said it was a genuine mistake. But I think there are some people who look at this and say this is just another example of how we are just not prepared to be responding to the influx of often non-English speaking detainees in our prisons.
Is there anything being done to make sure this kind of mix-up doesn't happen again?
Yeah, so DOC says they've changed a few protocols, including that they're going to have supervisors oversee every time this happens. But I think Ethan's done a lot of reporting that there's probably questions of even that, if that'll work, because they're so busy, and they're also they're understaffed, and a lot of these people are new to the job, so it's a challenge.
Yeah, that sounds kind of like a terrifying experience, and I appreciate your reporting on that. Thanks you for that article. Ethan Weinstein, I do want to ask, I had mentioned about this contract that the state of Vermont has with ICE. Governor Scott could end that contract if he wanted to. He has not expressed a desire to do so. Why?
Yeah, Governor Scott is the only person who would be able to end or modify this contract, at least on the state level. He says that, you know, if Vermont were to end its cooperation with federal authorities, these people would just be brought somewhere else. And a lot of times, you know, we're seeing folks who, they have lives in Vermont. Maybe they're farm workers or construction workers. And so if they are arrested by ICE and brought to Massachusetts or Maine or New Hampshire, they're separated from their families, from other forms of support. And he's said, you know, that seems like a worse situation than the one we have currently.
Well, you know, we talk a lot about entities that are losing funding. ICE is not one of them. Their funding is going to jump. It's going to increase. What might be their practical effect once that happens?
You know, their operations are going to grow. We know that in Vermont, they pay our prisons $180 per day per person that the state prisons hold for ICE. That's more than the state receives from other federal partners. It's more than ICE pays a lot of other states. So we could see that fee go up. We know that the Department of Corrections is frustrated with the way that this relationship is working currently. They want more guidelines, at least when they are discussing the ICE contract internally. They don't want to be receiving people from Massachusetts or from Maine. They want people who are apprehended in Vermont to come to Vermont's prisons, and they don't want to be a stopping point in this larger beast that's just getting bigger.
And there is a significant date coming up. Is it August 21st when the governor will make a decision on this contract?
Yeah, I believe it's August 21st. You know, we expect that it will be extended in some capacity, and we'll be following if it's going to change at all.
And we'll certainly be following your reporting on that. Thank you for the update on that. I also want to update you on something else here. Senator Peter Welch is co-sponsoring a bill that's known as the Visible Act, and this bill would require immigration enforcement officers to display clearly legible identification, prohibit non-medical face coverings that obscure identity or facial visibility, and require DHS to establish disciplinary procedures for violations and report annually to Congress on compliance. And, you know, that's Senator Welch's sort of, I guess, his try his foray into, dealing with having some of these ICE agents become visible to the public. I have to say that's probably not likely to, that bill is probably not likely to go anywhere, given Republicans in Congress and what they've given so far to President Trump and his immigration protocols. But we'll have to wait and see on that. But I did want to update you on that situation that Senator Welch is trying to address this issue. I want to move on to some health insurance news now. Lexi Krupp, you've been reporting on this, and this is difficult news coming up. This has to do with the just passed federal budget bill that has now cleared Congress. A lot of people in Vermont can end up losing health insurance. What kind of numbers are we talking about here?
Yeah, so this is a huge, sprawling piece of legislation with all these different provisions, but it impacts the Medicaid program and the state marketplace. And so, and some of those impacts will be immediate, some of them will be in a couple years, but the number you're referring to, state officials have said, when all is said and done, we expect 45,000 Vermonters to lose health insurance because of this legislation. Part of that has to do with changes through the Medicaid program. Colin's done some great reporting on this, basically adding more red tape. You may have heard about work requirements that, it may be that many people meet these work requirements, but it's just getting that documentation in every 6 months now, or even more. They may not be able to do that in time, in the right way, and that's why the state is expecting, this large number to lose insurance. Likewise, on the state marketplace side of things, there's going to be several changes there. One is that there's no longer going to be automatic renewals. So if you have a plan now, you just get rolled over. Instead, you're going to basically have to go through your whole application again. So put in where you work, why your employer can't cover health insurance, yada, yada, yada. And a lot of those plans are going to be way more expensive this year because of something called the expiration of enhanced subsidies. But basically during the pandemic, under some legislation from the Biden administration, it got a lot cheaper to buy these plans, especially if you make $60,000 or more a year. And now, as of right now, those enhanced subsidies or tax credits, those are going to go away starting January 1, 2026. And many people, their plans could double in price here. And we've talked about this a lot. Health insurance plans in Vermont are particularly expensive. We're talking, $1,000 or more a month, for someone with $60,000 in income. There's this real concern that a lot of people are just going to go without insurance because they're like, I can't afford it. I don't know, Colin, if you wanted to weigh in with any reporting you've done. Yeah,
no, I think you summarized it well. I think the second half of this then is okay, so what's the impact of all of these people losing insurance? And I think that's a really scary place that a lot of healthcare providers are in right now, knowing that they could be seeing a lot more uncompensated care, which is that they have someone come in their doors, they treat them, and then they try to figure out how do we get our money back. If you don't have insurance, if you're not covered by Medicaid, and you don't have the funds, where's that money come from? The hospital or your primary care, whoever, the Howard Center, they just have to eat that cost. And as we know, a lot of these agencies and hospitals do not have a lot of extra cash lying around. And so it is kind of this perfect storm of we're seeing a lot less money going to the hospitals and also a lot more people who are needing their care and might not have the money to pay for it. It's kind of a scary prospect.
I talked to some hospital leaders who are also like, we think a lot of people just aren't going to come in. They're going to defer care. And so when they do come in, it's going to be an emergency and we're going to see sicker people. And what's so interesting in Vermont is that we actually have a really low uninsured population here. It's about 3% of the state does not have health insurance. And some people think like that might be, as good as we're ever going to get. And now I saw a quote from Bernie Sanders that it's expected to double, that 6% of the state could no longer have health insurance when all is said and done. But I did want to add, like, as I said, a lot of those changes might take a couple years to go into effect. There are a couple things that are happening right now as a result of this legislation.
One of them affects Planned Parenthood, right?
Yeah. So again, this bill is like 1,000 pages or something. It's huge.
It was big.
And one provision in there is a change to the Medicaid program, which says Planned Parenthood is no longer eligible to receive any Medicaid dollars, and also is no longer eligible to receive something called Title X funding, but those are federal grants aimed at helping low-income people access birth control and other forms of reproductive care. So in Vermont, about a quarter of the patients who get care at Planned Parenthood have Medicaid as their health insurance. So under the law, it means that they can still go to Planned Parenthood, but Planned Parenthood can't get paid for any of the services they provide. That's about a little over 40% of their revenue from seeing patients. So it's like the folks who lead Planned Parenthood are like, either we see, if we continue to see these patients for free, like, we're gonna have to close some health centers.
It's unsustainable.
Yeah, we can't afford this. Right now, a Massachusetts judge has said that this has put a temporary hold on the legislation for 14 days as of Monday. So I'll have to do that math in my head, but we got another week or so of, Medicaid can still pay Planned Parenthood or reimburse Planned Parenthood. That court order might be extended for another 14 days. But if the courts decide that, this is indeed legal, then Planned Parenthood leaders are really worried about what this looks like. And they're talking to the Scott administration to say, hey, can the state help fill in any of this hole that we're facing right now? Well, so it's about in Vermont, the what I talked about, those Medicaid dollars and the federal grants account for a little over $2 million in revenue. So, I mean, maybe the state can fill that in, and lawmakers have set aside a big pot of money of $100 million, I believe, that is going towards sort of planning for getting less money from the federal government. But there is a lot of things that money will, a lot of asks for that money, including all of these other cuts to the Medicaid program in Vermont, because we're going to be seeing, all of fewer people on Medicaid means less state money and less federal money coming in to help cover some of those costs.
Right. And it feels like a bit of a slow boil. Like you said, a lot of this stuff won't be felt right away, but we're staring down the barrel with this one. This comes also on the heels of news that the Howard Center, the largest social service provider in the state, is going to have to lay off at least 30 people. They're going to have to cut some programs. Some of this deals with housing and some folks who are dealing with substance use disorder issues. That's some difficult news. But the Howard Center, Lexi, they've been losing money for years, right? I mean, this isn't necessarily new.
Yeah, so they've had 3 years of multi-million-dollar losses. Part of that is something that all Vermont businesses have been dealing with. Their healthcare costs have doubled in the past 5 years. They're also, seeing inflation, rising rent costs, a lot of different things. So their expenses are up. Their revenue, 90% of their revenue comes from Medicaid. So this has nothing to do with the Medicaid cuts that are sort of coming down the line. But they were just they've in the last year they've had single days cash on hand. So they're saying, this is not a sustainable place for us to be in. We need to change our programming and sort of thinking about, all right, what is our core mission here? And they said, we're not a housing organization. They are cutting some of the temporary housing units that they had offered to people who are in there seeking mental health treatment. Those are in Williston and Burlington. So they're losing around a dozen beds, along with a couple other programs. They're closing a day use program for people with mental health needs.
It's going to be tough. There's no question about it. Ethan Weinstein, briefly, there was a plan for a dental therapy program at Vermont State University, but not happening now?
Yeah, the legislature had paved the way about a decade ago for this program, which sort of served a niche in between dental hygienists and dentists. It drew some scrutiny from the auditor a couple of years ago because it had received a few $1 million and not gotten the program off the ground. It turns out it's never going to get the program off the ground, but there is a little bit of a silver lining. VTSU is going to expand their dental hygiene program, which is super competitive, and so we will have some more folks working in the dental field.
Okay,
hopefully.
well, all right. There's a little bit of good news, and I'll try to follow that up with letting you know if you're a fan of soccer, the Vermont Green Football Club tonight, if they win against the Western Mass Pioneers in Ludlow, they will for the first time ever win their regular season division, and they'll finish the regular season undefeated if they can win tonight or get a draw. That's all they got to do is get a draw, and they'll win that division for the first time ever. So good luck to Vermont Green tonight against the Western Mass Pioneers. We'll have to leave it there for this week. Thanks to our panel, Colin Flanders from 7 Days, Lexi Krupp from Vermont Public, and Ethan Weinstein from VTDigger. Thanks so much for watching and listening. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Hope you'll join us again for Vermont This Week.